In 1911, Empress Zita walked down the aisle adorned in diamonds and pearls, celebrated by the grandeur of an empire at its peak. But just a few years later, those very jewels, symbols of imperial splendor, became her only means of survival. After a failed political gamble and a sudden betrayal, a trusted advisor vanished with her jewels, intended to secure loans, and left her penniless. Pawning became her last recourse. As Zita later reflected, jewels can be redeemed, children's hunger cannot wait. Her journey from imperial opulence to hardship began on that wedding day, setting the stage for a story shaped by both splendor and sacrifice. Discover the untold story of a queen who pawned her crown to defy despair. A royal beginning, jewels and promise of an empire. The wedding of Archduke Charles and Zita of Bourbon-Parma on October 21, 1911, unfolded as a spectacle of imperial power and tradition. Schwarzau Castle filled with the continent's elite, and the villages nearby brimmed with decorations, their streets echoing with the anticipation of a union that many called the last grand wedding in Europe. A temporary post office managed the flood of gifts and telegrams, while Emperor Franz Joseph's presence and his dramatic reopening of the long-closed Emperor's Gate underscored the event's weight as a statement of dynastic stability. Yet beneath the surface of this carefully staged grandeur, the empire's foundations were already showing signs of strain. Zita's childhood prepared her for both privilege and uncertainty. As the 17th child of Robert I of Parma, who had lost his throne, and a mother who raised her children in exile, Zita grew up acutely aware of how quickly royal fortunes could shift. She mastered 5 languages and enjoyed a disciplined, faith-centered education under Benedictine nuns, her Catholic convictions shaping her sense of duty and resilience. These early lessons in adaptability and responsibility would later become crucial as her world transformed. Her marriage to Charles was exceptional among royal unions, a genuine love match rather than a political arrangement. Their engagement, announced in June 1911, was rooted in shared spiritual devotion, reflected in Charles's words, "Now we will help each other to reach heaven." This deep bond became the foundation for the challenges they would face, lending their partnership a rare strength. The gifts Zita received on her wedding day reflected both the personal and political importance of the occasion. The most striking was a diamond tiara from Emperor Franz Joseph, crafted by court jeweler Koschert. Set with over 1,000 diamonds, the tiara's flexible design allowed it to be reassembled as a necklace, a symbol of both imperial favor and adaptability. Little did she know this masterpiece would one day serve as literal collateral for her family's survival. From Charles, she received a 22-row pearl necklace, each strand secured by a wide, brilliant clasp. This necklace was not just a display of wealth, it was a personal gesture, a token of his devotion and trust. These 2 pieces stood out among the many lavish gifts, their value and symbolism amplified by the events that would soon follow. Every detail of the wedding, from the procession to Zita's attire, reinforced the narrative of an enduring empire. The jewels she wore were not merely ornaments, but statements, meant to reassure subjects of the Habsburgs' continued strength and unity. Yet even as she stood adorned in diamonds and pearls, the contrast between the ceremony's opulence and the empire's underlying fragility became increasingly clear. The political tensions at the empire's borders, though momentarily masked by celebration, threatened to upend everything. For Zita, the meaning of these jewels extended beyond their material worth. The craftsmanship and care behind each gift, and the symbolism they carried, tied her to the long history of her family and the empire. The tiara represented modernity and imperial adaptability, while the pearls from Charles spoke of personal trust and love. These treasures, so central to her identity as a bride and future empress, would later become reminders of a world lost and instruments of survival in times of crisis. Looking back, the wedding stands as a poignant marker, a final display of imperial opulence before the world changed irreversibly. In just a few years, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand would set off a chain of events that thrust Zita and Charles into the heart of a collapsing empire. The same jewels that once symbolized unity and power would soon take on a new role as lifelines in the face of war and upheaval. As the empire's twilight approached, the meaning of Zita's jewels shifted. No longer mere emblems of promise, they would become vital resources as her family confronted the realities of war, displacement, and loss. The next chapter of her life would demand all the resilience and faith she had cultivated as the world she knew gave way to crisis. From crown to crisis, the collapse of an empire. On June 28, 1914, a bullet in Sarajevo reshaped Zita's destiny overnight. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, set off a chain reaction that would soon engulf all of Europe in war. Overnight, Zita and her husband Charles found themselves pulled from the relative quiet of court life into the direct line of succession, their future suddenly bound to the fate of a vast and troubled empire. As the world around them changed, the burdens of leadership intensified, and Zita's life shifted from the rituals of imperial splendor to the daily realities of crisis management. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, Charles ascended the throne, and Zita became Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Their rise was not marked by celebration, but by a sober acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. Zita understood the weight of her new responsibilities, aware that the empire was already straining under the pressures of war, internal dissent, and growing nationalist movements. The sense of foreboding was palpable, and Zita's role demanded not only ceremonial presence, but real moral courage. Unlike many consorts, Zita refused to remain on the sidelines. She believed her duty extended beyond palace walls and into the heart of her suffering country. She visited military hospitals, sitting with wounded soldiers and offering words of comfort. She launched Work for the Child, a program designed to help children plunged into poverty by the war's devastation. These efforts, small in the face of the empire's collapse, made a difference to those who encountered her. Zita's compassion was not just a matter of public image, it was a reflection of her personal convictions. As she would later say, "I am against the war, as every woman who loves nothing more than to see the human race in happiness rather than tears." Her advocacy for peace and her willingness to share in the deprivation of her people set her apart, even as the imperial court itself pared back luxuries and adopted strict rationing to reflect the sacrifices made across the empire. Despite the turmoil, there were fleeting moments of imperial tradition. In December 1916, Zita and Charles were crowned King and Queen of Hungary in Budapest. The coronation, though subdued by war, was steeped in centuries-old rituals and symbolism. Zita wore the historic Habsburg Crown Pearls, a magnificent diadem adorned with diamonds and heirloom pearls, each detail reflecting generations of royal power. The ceremony, held in Matthias Church, was intended to affirm the monarchy's bond with the Hungarian people. Yet beneath the surface, the empire's dissolution was already underway. Nationalist uprisings, military defeats, and economic hardship undermined the authority of the crown, and the grandeur of the coronation could not disguise the reality that the Habsburg world was unraveling. By the end of World War I, the collapse of Austria-Hungary was complete. In 1918, revolutions swept through the empire, and the centuries-old dynasty fell apart in a matter of weeks. Charles and Zita, stripped of their titles, were forced into exile with their children. They left for Switzerland, carrying little more than the personal belongings they could manage. Their wealth, once vast, was now inaccessible, tied up in an empire that no longer existed. For Zita, the loss went beyond status and tradition. It was a daily struggle to provide for her family in unfamiliar and often hostile surroundings. In exile, the meaning of Zita's jewels changed. Once symbols of power and continuity, they became practical assets, quietly appraised and used as collateral for loans. The crown pearls, worn at her coronation, and the jewels from her wedding day were among the treasures that would eventually disappear, traded or lost as the family tried to survive. These pieces, once tied to a dynasty, were reduced to their material value, measured not in prestige, but in the ability to buy food and fuel for her children. As Zita adjusted to her new reality, her focus shifted entirely to her family's survival. The transition from empress to exile brought new challenges, and the hardships of displacement were compounded by the uncertainty of their financial future. But even as she navigated these difficulties, Zita's resolve and resourcefulness remained central to her story. The next test would come not from the loss of a throne, but from a betrayal that threatened the last remnants of her family's legacy. The betrayal that stole a legacy. With the collapse of their empire, Zita and Charles faced a stark reality. Almost everything they once owned was gone, seized by new governments or lost to the tides of war. What remained were a handful of precious jewels, her private wedding pieces, the Habsburg Crown Pearls, and storied gems like the Florentine diamond. These items held more than monetary value. They embodied generations of imperial history and the identity of a dynasty that had shaped Europe for centuries. The family's hopes, however, were not fixed on daily survival alone. In the early years of exile, Zita and Charles still believed in the possibility of restoring the monarchy in Hungary. Their remaining jewels were not simply security for food or shelter. They were the last bargaining chips in a high-stakes political gamble. The plan was to use these treasures as collateral for loans or to sell select pieces, raising funds to support a restoration attempt. For this, they relied on Bruno Steiner, a trusted financial advisor, to discreetly manage the jewels and negotiate on their behalf. Steiner's mandate was clear: use the jewels to finance the family's return to power. The stakes were enormous, not just for Zita and her children, but for the future of the Habsburg legacy itself. Among the entrusted items were the Habsburg Crown Pearls, which had once adorned Empress Elizabeth and symbolized centuries of dynastic continuity. Their presence was a living connection to a golden era, each pearl a testament to the house's enduring influence. Zita's wedding tiara and necklace, gifts from her marriage, carried more intimate memories, but were no less significant as symbols of hope and legitimacy. But the plan unraveled with devastating speed. After collecting the jewels, Steiner vanished. The family was left with only rumors and unanswered questions about his whereabouts. The loss was catastrophic. Not only did the jewels disappear, but with them went any realistic prospect of raising the funds needed for political restoration. The jewels that had once graced coronations and weddings, treasures that linked Zita to her ancestors, were gone, likely never to be seen again. The consequences were immediate and severe. The loans collapsed, the restoration effort faltered, and the family's finances plummeted from precarious to desperate. The loss of the jewels was not just a financial blow, it was a symbolic defeat, severing the last tangible ties to their imperial past. The Habsburg Crown Pearls, which Zita had worn for her coronation in Budapest, had once marked the dynasty's strength. Their disappearance signaled the end of a lineage's visible power. The Florentine diamond, another casualty, carried its own legend, now lost to history along with the family's hopes. Popular accounts often focus on Zita pawning her tiaras to feed her children. There is truth in these stories, but they simplify a more complex tragedy. The jewels were intended to fund a political future, not daily sustenance. Only after Steiner's betrayal, when all plans had failed and resources vanished, did Zita face the necessity of sacrificing what little remained for her children's basic needs. Her words capture the dilemma. Jewels can be redeemed. Children's hunger cannot wait. The reality was that the family's assets, meant to redeem an empire, ended up barely staving off hunger. The emotional toll of the betrayal ran deep. Every lost piece was a reminder of what had been, a wedding tiara given in hope, pearls worn in triumph, now vanished into the shadows of exile. The family's sense of identity, already battered by defeat and displacement, suffered another blow as the last symbols of their heritage slipped away. The Habsburgs were left with memories and stories, but little else to pass on. Years later, the devastation of Steiner's betrayal remained. The jewels, which were supposed to secure a future, instead marked the end of an era. The family's life in exile became a struggle for survival, their days shaped by scarcity and uncertainty. Even now, the fate of some treasures, like Zita's wedding tiara, remains a mystery. To this day, no one knows the full fate of her wedding tiara. Where might it be hidden now? With the loss of their legacy, Zita turned her attention to the challenges of daily life, drawing on the same determination that had once guided her as empress. A mother's strength, survival in exile. As the reality of exile set in, Zita's identity shifted from empress to mother and provider. Stripped of her former resources, she faced the daily challenge of keeping her family together, often relying on her own ingenuity to meet even the most basic needs. The image that endures is stark. Zita, once surrounded by imperial luxury, now gathering dandelion leaves from the fields of Quebec to prepare soup and salad for her 8 children. This single act, repeated in the quiet isolation of rural Canada, stands as a testament to her determination. The dandelion leaf soup was more than a meal. It was a symbol of her refusal to yield to despair, no matter how dire their circumstances became. The family's journey through exile was marked by instability and constant adaptation. After leaving Austria, they moved from Switzerland to Spain to Belgium and finally to Canada. Each move brought new uncertainty, and each country offered only temporary respite. Their living conditions grew increasingly modest, with bare rooms and scant furnishings. Material comfort was replaced by a daily struggle for survival. Yet, the greatest hardship was not the loss of palaces or jewels, but the relentless pressure imposed by outside forces. Allied authorities intercepted promised donations, ensuring the exiles couldn't rebuild their coffers. This was not accidental misfortune. It was a deliberate policy to keep Charles and Zita from regaining influence or mounting any restoration efforts. The family's poverty was engineered, deepening the injustice of their situation. That hardship reached its most devastating point in 1922, when Zita lost her husband, Emperor Charles I. Isolated on the Portuguese island of Madeira after yet another failed attempt to reclaim his throne, Charles died from pneumonia at just 34 years old. Zita, pregnant with their 8th child and now a widow at 29, held his hand as he took his final breath. She was left not only to mourn the love of her life, but to assume full responsibility for 8 fatherless children. This moment of loss, personal, political, and spiritual, marked a turning point. From that day forward, Zita carried not just the grief of an exiled wife, but the immense burden of safeguarding her family's future alone. Despite these obstacles, Zita's sense of purpose never faltered. She took on the role of both mother and guardian of the Habsburg heritage. Her children's upbringing became her mission. Zita insisted on strict routines, blending discipline with faith. Days began before dawn, sometimes with 5 a.m. mass attended alongside local fishermen's wives, an act of humility and devotion that set the tone for the rest of the day. Education was rigorous and rooted in tradition. She declined offers that would separate her children or compromise their cultural identity, such as when she refused King Alfonso XIII's suggestion to send Otto to a Spanish elite school. Instead, Zita preserved Austrian and Hungarian methods, determined that her children would not forget who they were or where they came from. Resourcefulness became a necessity. Zita mended clothing until it could no longer be patched and taught her children to accept simplicity without complaint. Meals were stretched with whatever could be found or foraged. The story of the dandelion leaf soup is not an isolated anecdote. It captures the reality of their daily life. Every meal, every repaired garment was an act of care and resilience. Zita's sacrifices were quiet but constant, her actions shaped by a sense of duty that never diminished. Her faith, tested by loss and hardship, remained her greatest support. Even as she struggled to provide for her children, Zita's devotion never wavered. She attended Mass whenever possible, sometimes walking long distances or seeking out priests in unfamiliar places. On the journey into exile, she begged to receive the Eucharist aboard the boat, a moment that revealed both her vulnerability and her steadfastness. This faith became her anchor and her children's inheritance, grounding them in values that outlasted any material possession. Zita's compassion extended beyond her immediate family. In Canada, she organized and spoke at conferences to raise funds for displaced Austrians and Hungarians, staying in humble religious institutions and traveling second class to conserve resources. She pushed herself to overcome her natural reserve, giving interviews and advocating for those who had lost everything. Even in exile, Zita's sense of responsibility to her people and her heritage remained strong. Her efforts were not grand gestures, but persistent, everyday acts of service. Through all these trials, Zita's legacy was not measured in jewels or titles, but in her unwavering commitment to her children and to the values she hoped they would carry forward. The hardships of exile, far from breaking her, revealed the depth of her strength and love. These quiet acts of endurance and sacrifice became her true legacy, one that would shape her children and inspire those who learned her story. As Zita's life in exile unfolded, it became clear that her greatest treasures were not the jewels lost to history, but the resilience, faith, and love she preserved in her family. Her journey stands as a testament to the quiet power of endurance in the face of unimaginable loss. Zita's legacy reaches far beyond royal circles. Her example resonates with anyone who has ever faced adversity for the sake of loved ones. Recognized today as a servant of God in the Catholic Church's process of beatification, her life continues to inspire as a model of moral courage and steadfast faith. What would you sacrifice for your family if everything else was gone? If Zita's unwavering faith and resilience moved you, let us know in the comments and share how family has shaped your own life.